Final Fantasy XVI was released on June 22nd to an 88 score on Metacritic, just to be review bombed by many players, dropping the user score down to a 6.8. Some blame the low scores on the game being a PS5 exclusive, while others claim their low scores are justified from their experience playing the game. The developer Square Enix took a risky approach to the creation of Final Fantasy XVI by redefining the series for a new generation, moving further away from the turn-based combat system Final Fantasy was critically acclaimed for. Final Fantasy is a franchise that has revolutionized the RPG genre over the years, so it's not surprising they continue to push the boundaries with new ideas. Square Enix has not been shy with sharing their inspiration for the game coming from Game of Thrones, which is obvious as soon as you step into the world. This gave Square Enix a good starting point to create a strong narrative-based RPG. Now keep in mind the word RPG can mean almost anything in today's gaming. Comparing a game like Final Fantasy to, let's say, Hogwarts Legacy, you will see how wide this genre can reach. Hogwarts Legacy was a game that allowed the player to not only create a custom character, but also make choices throughout the story that affects the outcome and ending of the game. Square Enix, on the other hand, opted to go for a more linear narrative, focusing on a single story with one predetermined ending. That means regardless of the choices you make throughout the game, you will always end up in the same place. In this video, I will critique and analyze every aspect of Final Fantasy XVI, the story, combat, and everything else in between. I will also have timestamps in the video so you can watch it in pieces, as it'll be a long video. Now warning, this video will contain non-major spoilers throughout, and some major spoilers in the story section. If what you are looking for is a spoiler-free review, I also have that, and I will link that on screen right now to go check that out. The first thing you will notice when you play Final Fantasy XVI is the quality at which the graphics of this game were made. This is one of, if not the best quality game I've ever played. The graphics themselves are not anything special in terms of resolution or image quality. Where the game really kills it is with the lighting. The lights, especially those of the icon powers, are really something to appreciate. The cutscenes use extra lighting to add more details and shadows to the character models and environment. Reflections are also fine-tuned. Things like puddles or shiny surfaces reflect the surroundings appropriately, whereas a rougher surface does not reflect with the same quality. Final Fantasy XVI is not an open world game, which allowed for the world to have a much higher attention on visual effects and making good use of the new rendering techniques without having to worry about loading in a full open world, which takes up way more memory to create. The world of Valisthea varies from large castles to small towns, all brought to life with great attention to detail. I can't get over how real the world feels, like an actual place, not just a backdrop. Looking out at the vast land is unlike many games you can find. Blades of grass react to your character's movement. Whether you load into an indoor dungeon or an outdoor area, the game does a great job of loading in without any hitches. The game uses the quality of the PS5 to do that in little to no time as well. One part of the game Square Enix seemed to put a little effort into was the sky, whereas the rest of the game feels alive, reacting to what happens around us. The sky is just a stagnant skyline. The resolution is a bit blurry, and it never changes or moves unless the story calls for the change. A highlight of the graphics was the quality of the character models. They look absolutely fantastic with a great attention to detail. The hair specifically looks high quality with great physics to move the hair side to side with player movement. Although maybe not the same quality as the main characters, the NPC and animals still have high quality attributes with a focus on realistic physics. I did find one problem with the character models in this game, which was the lip syncing. Not as much with Clive, but with some of the other side characters, I noticed the lip syncing was off by just a touch. At first, I thought this was because of English being the dub over of another language, but I confirmed that the game was in fact synced for the English language. Once I realized the syncing, I started to pay attention, and I will say it was not every scene or every moment, but specific scenes in the game. Especially side quests, I noticed it a bit more. Sometimes it was barely noticeable, other times it was extremely noticeable. I've seen threads saying the game does not hold the quality the larger the viewing screen is, but on my 28-inch monitor, it looked great. During some of the boss fights, like the Akashic Dragon, I did experience a drop in frames, which did hurt my overall experience. I think Square Enix decided to cover up the frame drops by adding in so many unique color animations during the fight that I couldn't see what was going on. I would have liked for them to tone down some of the amounts of animations, that way I could precisely see what Clive was doing. I want to talk about the audio for a minute because you will be listening to it throughout your whole journey. Final Fantasy XVI raises the bar for video game audio in ways we may soon see in newer titles. Series composer Masayoshi Soken spoke about the innovative interactive music used in this game. Instead of using static music that continually loops during the fight, the soundtrack is reactive to the fight and syncs up with every part of the battle. Whether you are a less skilled player that takes longer to complete a fight or a high skilled player who beats the fight quickly, the team also created a new reverb effect so that the sound will bounce off an object in real time depending on the material and distance of the object. On top of that, the team implemented a system where the game generates sound effects on the fly dependent on the character's motion. All three of those features together create for moments that feel immersive beyond explanation. I really can't wrap my head around that technology, so I'm not even going to try. All I can say is it's very impressive what they were able to do with the soundtrack, and for a game focused on immersion and narrative, it worked out perfectly. Besides the main story, you have 76 side quests to complete. For me, 76 quests was a bit too much for the pacing of the main story. You unlock the ability to do side quests about 3 hours into the game after completing the prologue and a couple of main story missions. In general, there is not a lot of variety in the type of side content we have, which is to be expected in a linear story game. The problem I encountered is just how boring the early game quests were. The main story had me trekking across the world, taking down powerful icons, stealing their powers, fighting for the fate of the world, just for the side quest to have me collect some dirt or deliver an item like I'm an Amazon driver. The side quests are tedious and repetitive. Most of them had me walking 200 feet to defeat an enemy I've already fought or defeat an enemy on the path I was already going for the main story. None of the early game side quests take me to areas I haven't been to or give me rare rewards I couldn't have got otherwise. On top of that, when I finally completed the quest, I expected to be met with at least a decent reward, but all that I got was some XP with a small amount of gil that I never had a shortage of. Overall, the reward of the quest was just insufficient for me to want to put my time into. I think the real problem with the rewards is just the lack of itemization in the game. There are no good items to really give us, and if you play the game without limiting yourself, you never need the best items to beat the bosses. The crafting system itself was pretty much useless, which makes the items useless, which makes the side quest to unlock the items also useless. I would only return to the hideaway when forced to for story purposes, since I did not die once during the main story. The only positive to completing side quests is the world building. Most of the side quests, if not all of them, aim to thicken the main plot of the game and develop some interesting lore. The problem is, you need to complete at least 25% of the game, if not more, to start getting the quests that feel rewarding, at least with world building. And since most of the quests are mechanically boring to complete, I think a lot of people, including myself, will stop before the good ones come along. At their best, the quests have cool stories and enhance the world. At their worst, it's just a filler that wastes your time instead of staying immersed in the story. I don't like the idea of having to grind through an annoying side quest just to get to the good part later in the game. I think if they took out about half of the side quests and made each of the 35 or so more valuable, better rewards, and more focused on world building, I think I would have been more excited to journey through them. I'm personally a fan of side content more than I am side quest in video games, as I like the idea of having like mini games to complete to get a cool reward, rather than go deliver this item and you return for a below average reward that a lot of games do. Unfortunately, the only other side content we got in Final Fantasy 16 is the hunt board. The hunt boards themselves is where you want to spend your time if you want large rewards with high level crafting items. If you choose to hunt down the higher tier monsters, you will be rewarded with high amounts of XP for beating a boss, which is fun for those who want more of a combat challenge. Speaking of the combat in this game, I'm sure to many of you, combat is the most important part of any RPG game. Difficulty is the biggest criticism of Final Fantasy 16 combat. Simply put, the game is just way too easy. I'm usually not one to overly criticize the combat in a game, especially the difficulty, but in this case, I do think it's well deserving. At no point during the story did I ever fear for my life. Now, I'm not the type of person that thinks every game needs to be Elden Ring difficult to be fun, but I also shouldn't have to limit myself to even make it a challenge. The base difficulty is too low to demand the player to dig deeper into the nuances of combat. If you search online, you will find all the comments telling you, take off your high level swords, lower your armor, don't upgrade your abilities. I think that's pretty ridiculous. Relying on self-imposed restrictions to make things challenging or more fun is an incomplete way to improve what should already be better from the start. I'm not going to put a blindfold on just to play a game because the game is too easy. It's one thing to not use accessories that literally are in the game to play it for you. It's another thing to ask your players to not be able to play the base game to have a challenge. I understand why the overpowered accessories are in the game. The base audience of the franchise may not want to deal with tougher combat and would rather the game almost play for them so they can just focus on the story. Utilizing the accessories that complete combos for you, dodge for you, and drink potions for you. But even without those accessories being equipped, the game is a joke in terms of difficulty. I was never even close to danger with the bosses. And then you would come across the few bosses that were at least a bit challenging just to be hit with so many QuickTime events, which I did like the QuickTime events for cinematic purposes, but for actual combat, it's not the greatest. It's a bit weird when you actually think about it. They added in all these options to make the gameplay easier for those who don't want a challenge, but then completely ignored all the other people who do want a challenge. The only way to get a true challenge in this game is to play the game on New Game Plus, which does increase the difficulty of enemies and increase their enemies' health. The issue is that I shouldn't need to complete a 30 to 35 hour story mode just to replay the game at a difficulty that is more engaging. It's really a silly idea. I don't see myself doing another playthrough just to feel the difficulty, if I'm being honest. It's a disservice to fans to lock a harder difficulty behind completion of the game. It's one thing if the game is hard by itself, like in Elden Ring. Most of my friends have still not beaten Elden Ring, so it makes sense that game is hard enough as it is. The higher difficulty is just extra bonus for those true diehard fans that want to play through multiple times. I think in most cases, putting harder difficulties behind New Game Plus is just outdated. Another issue with the combat being easy is that it makes the combat feel a lot more boring than it is intended to be. When combat is easy and you are never in real danger, you don't need to learn the most powerful combos or the best tactics to complete the boss battles. Instead, the game turns into a button mash with no real plan or strategy. Clive's base moveset is as basic as it gets. Spam square, you get a 4-hit combo, followed by spamming abilities, and it's an easy defeat every single time. Even the more difficult bosses, if you want to call them that, only take a few rounds of abilities to take them down. I found there was never a need to exchange icon abilities or learn new abilities late into the game, because I never ran into a battle or boss I couldn't handle. Especially with the use of the stagger system, Being able to stagger the main bosses meant that if you spam a round of your abilities and a couple of base attacks, you would get about a 10-second window to do extra damage to the boss without any threat. This idea is not the worst, the problem is the implementation of it. Because there is no real tactic to causing a stagger, no need for perfect parries to initiate or perfect timed abilities, and instead it just takes a span of all your abilities. It ends up becoming brain dead spam until the stagger bar is depleted, in which you would then unleash everything you had to do high amounts of damage. It feels like at times the enemies sit in the middle and soak up damage. I know there are players that will say, well, then that's on you. There are more combos to learn and tactics to learn if you want to. You're just choosing not to engage with it. And you would be right. I am choosing not to. But that's because the game doesn't call for it. I'm sure some people like creating these crazy combos and parries to make the most satisfying combat possible. But for me, if the game itself does not need it for the average player to complete the game, then I don't consider it to be a base option for the game. Sure, maybe the player who will play through the game 4 times will be significantly better than myself. They'll have ability combos I can never dream of. But for the average player who completes the game once, you don't really need any of that type of stuff. I expected the boss fights themselves to at least be unique with lots of different mechanics. That's not the case. Most of the enemies you face follow a very similar format, and it ends up being very predictable. Even if you don't learn the timing, you're usually able to dodge the attacks. Even the icon versus icon fights were never a challenge, which I thought they would be. They ended up being brute force fights, even as you unlocked more abilities. The hit detection was also not very good in these fights. I didn't feel the problem as much when I was Clive in the battles, but as soon as I switched to the icons, it's like hit detection went out the window. I'm not sure if other people thought about it or cared about it, but to me, it was just weird to have that as a part of the game to just skip over. Ifrit felt like he would swing into a bunch of nothing and do damage. I felt like I was punching air for most of the fight, and it ended up just becoming a complete snoozer. The strongest part of the combat is the presentation of the fights. The icon abilities themselves are amazing to look at, although at times it does become hard to visually see what's going on in the fight because of how many colors there are flying around the world. If your only care is to see Clive beat up the enemies in the most beautiful and cool way possible, then I think you will be plenty satisfied with the combat. The presentation of abilities is one of the best parts of the game. It never really gets old. The Final Fantasy XVI fights are more about the spectacle and wow factor than the actual combat itself. Now, I know the game is a narrative-driven game and the combat is more of a secondary focus, so for a lot of people, that will be a deterrent from ever finishing the game. Some players feel the game is not worth playing if the combat is going to be that easy. I think it's an unfortunate spot for Square Enix to be in. A big part of the problem was simply avoidable by having one more difficulty setting in the base game, which then allows for players to find the level that best suits their playstyle and allows those players that want the harder challenge to also enjoy the game. Boss fights are a large portion of what Final Fantasy XVI is, so I thought it was only right to go through each of the main boss fights and discuss what I liked and didn't like with them. I'm going to skip some of the unimportant bosses on the list because they didn't have any importance or big mechanics. The first boss, Morbol, is just for the tutorial of learning mechanics, so there's not much to go over with that fight. It's a Venus flytrap style monster, and as far as tutorial bosses go, it does the job. The next fight is the fight between both icons of fire, which sees us fighting as the Phoenix icon instead of a human form for the first time. Although the fight itself looked cool, it had a lot of problems with frames dropping while I was playing. I never felt mechanically challenged either during the fight. I mainly spammed fireball attacks, which was a bit disappointing for the first icon fight, if I say so myself. The next fight was against the Shiva Dominant, who we know is Jill. The fight itself was simple compared to what is to come. Jill never transformed into the Shiva icon, so it ends up being a basic sword fight with some icon powers sprinkled in. I personally like this style of fighting the best in this game. The abilities themselves were very easy to dodge, but that's pretty much how this game goes, as you'll learn as I keep going. After a few more small boss fights, we get to Benedicta, who is one of the many dominants we will face in this game. The fight comes in two different phases. The first is a straight up human fight against Benedicta. There's no real mechanics to it, and soon as you stagger her, you can finish her off. The second half of the fight sees her enter her icon form, not to be confused with an actual icon fight. That's two different things. This is more of a power up with more abilities. Think of it as more of a Super Saiyan more than a transformation. The fight itself posed more of a challenge since she was a lot faster, stronger than the first phase, which made her unpredictable. However, for some reason, they decided to make the quick time events completely stagger in one shot for this battle, which ended up making the fight significantly easier. It was a missed opportunity in my book. A little bit later on in the story, we come across Garuda, which is Benedicta's icon. This fight is also done in two phases, as you will see with a lot of fights in this game. The first phase is Clive fighting Garuda on top of a small island. Because the fight was on top of such a small place, Garuda's attacks were predictable and easy to dodge. If you continue to dodge and aim for the head, you can take down Garuda in no time. The second phase of Garuda shows us our first look at fighting as Ifrit. The fight is flooded with quick time events. If you use the basic melee attacks and win the quick time events, there is really no mechanics to be used. Every third basic melee attack you land in a combo does significant blows to Garuda's health, so that mixed in with how many quick times there are, and the health bar goes down very, very fast. The next boss after Garuda is just a few small bosses away. Once again, it is a 3-phase fight. Well, technically it's 2, I'll explain. The Infernal Icon and Infernal Shadow are dark versions of Clive himself. The first phase against the Icon is straightforward, as is most fights where we take on a larger enemy with Clive. The attacks are predictable once again, so the goal is to stay close to the feet and dodge the obvious attacks incoming. Once the head drops to the ground, attack it, as that is the weak point. The second phase of the fight, geez, how many times have I actually said phase? Can someone keep track of me, please? Anyways, the second phase is against a dark version of ourselves, Clive Rossfield. I found this to be one of the more entertaining fights in the game. The Shadow has all the same abilities that Clive has, with some extras, is very fast, and the fight also teaches us the new power-up ability that is useful throughout the rest of the game. It's basically Clive Super Saiyan mode. Because the Shadow has all the same abilities, I had it make for the more interesting and challenging fight. I said there is a third phase, and technically that is true. We both go into icon form, but I don't do any fighting. It's all cinematic quick time events, so there's not really anything to it. I guess it's kind of a phase of the fight. I guess it could also be a cutscene. It's really your choice. The next fight up is Typhon, later becoming Typhon the Transgressor during the same fight. I know, shocker, multiple phases again. There is a theme here. The first part is very easy with Ifrit. Just use your circle to dodge with your newly learned wildfire ability and get close to deal melee damage. There are some AoE abilities, but the fight goes so fast they were almost non-existent in my personal experience. The second phase sees stronger versions of the abilities with new abilities that do deal high damage if you are not careful. The use of wildfire in this part will be extremely important to stay out of the way of the abilities, unlike how I did in the clip you're probably watching with the way that I was running into the demon walls. If you do pay attention, it shouldn't cause you too many problems. Just be patient, way more than I was. Liquid Flame is the next boss we come across in the story. This monster has high mobility and moves around the arena quickly, but once you find the timing, it shouldn't be too hard to defeat. If you wait for the enemy to dash into you and dodge, you will have a few seconds to get off hits while it recovers from a kneeling position. Liquid Flame also has a dragon form, but that doesn't really change much of the fight. You probably should use range attacks during this time, but I ended up using Phoenix Shift and just went in and hit melee attacks because the range is just so weak. Next up is the fight against Hugo. I found Hugo to be one of the more challenging bosses in the game. Although he has strong attacks and fast mobility, the first part of the fight is easy to complete, mainly because you only need to take out half of his health bar, which will then have a cutscene where you go to the second portion of the fight. In this portion, he has wide AoE abilities where he comes up from the floor to attack, but if you dodge, you can see the ring of where the attack is going to affect. You can also guard break Hugo when you do enough damage when he is blocking with these giant hands. When he is stunned, use that time to unleash your abilities, and besides that, there's really not much to it. The biggest and longest fight in the game is the Titan fight, which is Hugo's icon that you will fight. It took about an hour to beat, and the worst part was, it was also the most boring fight, so that kind of sucked, right? The first part is just a standard fight against the icon. It was fairly straightforward, fairly easy. The abilities are slow and predictable, so once again, get up close, chop at the legs, it'll end pretty quickly. The second phase, this is where the problems begin. I just lost complete interest when I went to the Titan Lost fight. It looked really, really cool. The mechanics of the fight were extremely boring. You sat there dodging slow attacks on top of the Titan Lost because of how big Titan was. You would just lay your abilities into huge rock parts after you dodged. I really did not like it. It almost seemed like someone else created the fight than the rest of the game. It was kind of out of left field in a sense. I mean, they say every icon or every dominant is the same strength levels, but Titan Lost is just so much bigger than any of the other dominants we run into, so I don't really know. And then we get to the third phase. It was just a free fall, like the Phoenix fight in the beginning, and once again, it was not very entertaining. Those fights were not very good when you were free falling or flying around. Just stick to the basics, you complete it in no time. Now, next was one of the harder and more interesting fights we had in the story against Bahamut. The cool part about this fight was switching between the Phoenix and Ifrit during portions of the fight. I wasn't a huge fan of the Phoenix ranging portion, as I've stated multiple times. I didn't like the ranging parts, but I will say it was one of the more challenging parts of the game. I did run out of my heals during that part. Part of it may be just because I didn't know what was going on, but a big critique I had of this fight specifically, which I had mentioned before in the combat section, was just the hit detection when Ifrit and Bahamut are in space. This is definitely the worst hit detection in the game, in my opinion. I didn't feel like any of my attacks hit at all because of the way the detection worked, but I was obviously still doing damage. Even when I watch the fight back, I'm trying to look and see if the hit detection looks better, and I think the hit detection in general is just the worst in the game in this fight. The second to last boss is Barnabas. There is 2 different fights for Barnabas in this game. The first I found to be one of the more enjoyable fights in this game. He uses his ability to teleport around the arena and sneak up on Clive, so it is very hard to time. You must wait for the teleportation to fully end before your attack if you actually want to do it the right way. That's not usually what I do. The only downside of this fight is that it's not winnable, so that kind of sucked. Once Barnabas has a purple health bar, you will not be able to bring him down anymore, and you will lose, which is a bit unfortunate, but I guess it's needed for story purposes. The second fight is different than the first. In the first phase, you will need to precision dodge to open an attack, as he will parry your basic attacks. This is one of the better and more challenging mechanics in this game. I wish more of the fights had powers like this. Having Shiva's power to freeze him when I dodge did make it a bit easier because I had more openings to attack. There are 3 more phases of the fight, but they more or less follow all the same suit. The second phase is just enhanced abilities from the first phase. The third phase, the most important part, is to deplete the purple bar so that you don't get one-shotted. He does still attack during this portion, so it is important to get your dodges correct so that you can do high damage and get the purple bar off. The fourth phase is when Barnabas finally turns into the Odin form. It follows suit with the rest of the fight. Dodge the sword combinations, it opens them up for attacks, and then you can just finish him off. At this point, the only boss left to fight is Ultima, which you will fight multiple times. The first fight against Ultima, the best way to attack is to close in on him fast, deal damage around him because of the size of the AoE abilities. Once again, follow suit with the rest of the game. Very simple, straightforward, like every other single fight. The final boss fight with Ultima contains 4 different phases. That one as well is about an hour long, similar to the Titan fight. The first phase is purely cinematic, so that's pretty straightforward. Just do the cinematic events. The second phase is Ultima, which is very similar to the first Ultima fight. If you pay attention and dodge, it's easy as the attacks are slow and telegraphed. The third phase of the fight is against Ultima Risen, which is an icon portion. Once again, there's not really too much of importance here. Just dodge the attacks, and when you can attack, do it. I was expecting more mechanics, but it's pretty simple. The fourth and final phase of the game has Clive fight against Ultimalius, I believe is how you say it. At this point, both Ultimalius and Clive will use large amount of the abilities you learned over the game that helps tie the combat together. I thought that was pretty cool to have cinematics for that. But if you follow the same tactics you have the rest of the game, you should have no problem with this fight. It wasn't much harder. As you can see, there's really not a ton of variation with the boss fights in the game. As I laid them out, they're almost all on a similar path. They're all multiple phases for the most part, very similar mechanics. I hoped for more unique and interesting boss fights, but after the first few fights of dodge and spam abilities, I started to lose my interest. I think adding in more weaknesses or strengths in each fight that could have affected the outcomes could have been more interesting. The way the Titan fight or the Hugo fight was with the blocking fist, having more things like that, especially because the triangle range attack was just so weak. Your real only option was to get up close and melee. I understand Final Fantasy XVI is a cinematic focused game, but with so many bosses and so much emphasis put on the boss battles, I would have done without all of the phases or bosses and just focus on a few of them with major boss fights and more story. Now, I wanted to speak on the narrative of this game as it's pretty much the most important part of this game. I mean, it has 11 hours of cinematics for crying out loud. The game itself is supposed to be a cinematic storytelling masterpiece, which at times it is, but generally it is very confusing and leaves more questions than answers. The game follows Clive Rosfield through 3 different time periods in his life, like the developers have stated, but it wasn't as equal as I thought or hoped for. Instead, I ended up spending just a few hours on the first 2 time skips respectively, and then most of the time of the game is spent in the third time period. The first 2 time periods were really there just to set up the third time skip, more or less. Instead of calling it a massive story that follows a character through 3 distinct periods of his life, I think it would have been better suited to tell us it's a story of Clive in his 30s, and then it also has some flashbacks into other areas of his life. There's a lot of narrative to cover, so I'm going to start by talking about the overarching problems I have with the narrative. Then I will dive deeper into individual plot points. The major issue I had with Final Fantasy XVI's narrative is that it was just boring and tedious at moments. Now, there were great moments. It was not all bad. I don't want to take that away from the game. Some people may enjoy it more than others. But for most of the story, I felt myself completely losing focus and not paying attention to anything that was being said by most of the characters. I will say the first 30 to 40% of the story was really engaging and moved with extreme pace, but it's like they used up all of their budget by that point and then dropped off the story off of a cliff. By the end, I just wanted it to be over so I could move on. Even the end resolution left me completely unmoved. They spent the first hours of the game setting up a specific type of story where nations were at war with each other over a power struggle, And then they ended up pushing that all aside throughout the game. And then we ended up going around the world having these one-on-one dominant fights and destroying crystals, and that was pretty much it. They have stated multiple times they took inspiration from Game of Thrones for this game, but I don't think you can throw in a bunch of characters together, have a bunch of unanswered questions, and then call it a day. Instead of letting the characters develop and create a good story, they try to continually switch up the story to keep us guessing. Really, what happened is they teleported to a bunch of different places, making no sense like a drunk uncle was talking at a party. I think because of the questions, I was left with that is why I ended up feeling so unfulfilled. So I want to talk about the plot points that I feel caused these problems. The first major narrative problem I have is Ultima showing up at Phoenix Gate. At the time, all we see is the character in a brown cloak showing up to Phoenix Gate to unlock Ifrit and Clive. That part I understand. We later learned the brown cloaked character in the flashback was Ultima. That part I also understand. But why is it that Ultima showed up in the same clothes Joshua decided to wear 13 years into the future? That part, I'm sure there was no real rhyme or reason, and it mainly was there to confuse the players and throw us off the scent. And then later, Dark Clive was also wearing those same exact robes. Like, what was the point of that twist? Speaking of the 13-year time skip, why did Joshua not reach out to find Clive? And why did he not want Clive to know he was alive? Do we ever figure that one out? It's never explained why Joshua is hiding from Clive. And when people say he wasn't hiding, no, he literally ran away from him multiple times. I forget the town name, but we were in a desert town and he ran out the window when he was sick. So he definitely was running. And how did he even learn to track Ultima? How did Joshua find out about Ultima to require such dedication to track him? The whole time skip is about Clive trying to figure out Joshua. Well, he's trying to find the hooded brown figure, but it never gets explained why Joshua did what he did. All we must go off of is educated guesses. Seems like such a weird detail to overlook, seeing as they made the brown cloak individual such a pivotal part of the early game. Kind of jumping back a beat to the end of the first before the time skip, we find out that Clive and Joshua's mom was the one who was evil and destroyed their family. That twist got me on the edge of my seat. I was really happy at that time, or maybe not happy, but like excited to see what happened. And then they made it seem like she would have a pivotal role in a larger scheme. Then in the story, all she ended up being was just a really selfish individual, and she only cared about status. That was a bit of a disappointment for me. I was hoping she was the grand leader of everything with Ultima or something like that. At this point in the story, we jump back into the second time skip. I'm not really sure if it's a second time skip or if it's after the first time skip. I'm really not sure how to track that, but this middle section of the life, which then picks up Clive as he tries to assassinate Jill. I mean, first question, how did he not know that was Jill before he attacked her? Am I the only one missing that part? Because he grew up with her and she looks identical to what she looked like as a kid. So this for me is when the game started to go off the rails. After Clive became Ifrit and wanted to destroy the mother crystals, it was like the whole first part of the game was non-existent. Ever since the point Clive agreed to help Sid destroy the mother crystals, I think the game really completely lost its way. Up until this point, it seemed like it was going to be about a war of nations. Clive was even in the back lines of an existing war trying to assassinate another dominant. It was then changed from a game about political conflict to a game of hunting down the big bad guy who wants to destroy the world and is some sort of alien, which is kind of counterintuitive because we got so much lore about the kingdoms and we really never got lore about the icons, but the story itself is mainly about the icons later on and not about the kingdoms, so it's a bit of an opposite. Clive heads into full kingdoms to destroy mother crystals, taking down these dominant icons, and not one king or leader anywhere else ever mentions, like, hey, this guy is destroying every other kingdom and city. Maybe we should think about stopping them. We want our mother crystals, don't we? And the mother crystals are supposed to be a central part of the whole civilization. By making all the kingdoms non responsive to all the world around them, it just makes the kingdom and its lore completely irrelevant. The back half of the story is forgettable and predictable, following the same format for the rest of the game. You go to a new city, do some side quests disguised as a main quest, and help out some person in that city. You then head to the kingdom you need to go to. You have an icon battle, destroy a crystal, head back to the hideaway for more talking. It's disappointing because the game itself had good bones for an interesting story. I think it was just poorly executed. On paper, the plot makes sense and seems fine, but in playing the game, I got bored plenty of times throughout the game. Speaking on the mother crystals, it seems like a misstep that no one ever stopped to even question if the mother crystals actually caused blight after destroying multiple ones and not seeing any change in the world. At least a conversation from Clive and some others about is this truly the right path would have at least made some sense. Sid originally believed the mother crystals were causing the blight, but how did he truly know? There's no way you could know without destroying him, and once he destroyed him, there was still no change, so why continue? It didn't help that the main villain of the game, Ultima, was painfully boring. His reasoning boiled down to humans are stupid, free will is bad. Every time Ultima talked, I honestly wanted to skip to the point where I felt like my time was wasted. I felt no substance to anything Ultima spoke about or what he did. What makes the best villains, in my opinion, is when you can actually look into their perspective and you're like, yeah, that makes sense why they're doing what they're doing. I don't agree with it, maybe, but it actually makes sense what they're doing. With Ultima, I had no remorse because not only did I not care about his reasoning was, it just also didn't ever make sense. It was not relatable at all. I honestly think Annabella, who is Clive and Joshua's mother, would have gone for a way better main villain of the game. Instead of going off the rails about these massive dominant icon fights, which, I mean, they still could have been in the game, don't get me wrong, but the story could have been more grounded in political warfare, very much on par with their Game of Thrones counterpart. Annabella falls right into that role easily. I think they really wasted her. Obviously, who wouldn't want the Mother Crystals gone? Because that's what gives Annabella her powers to rule the Empire. So she would have been all over that. She also cares extreme amounts about the bloodlines, obviously, that we could tell from, and she hates the bearers. All the story and pieces were already there. I unfortunately think sometimes in games, it's the time and budget for game creation that causes a lot of problems. As we know, they left out a couple of other icons. I don't remember what his name is. I think it's like Levitican or something like that, but they just completely left him out. So obviously they just didn't have enough time to add in everybody. So there's just no way the writers can be so creative and genius to create the whole massive world around it, but then skip over the most basic and simple plot holes if it's not just time and money. Overall, there's not a lot of closure on just about any character in the game. The most we get are some hints or possible side quests that give us basic information, but it never answers all of our questions. Realistically, I could continue to go on for hours with some of these topics, but I tried to be as concise with the points I was making. So, the question stands, from the average player's perspective, how did this game fare, and did they get what they wanted out of the game? Presentation, I would say they did pretty good. I thought it was great. They created a large-scaled environment. It was very beautiful to look at, and it has some really awesome cutscenes throughout the game. The story, I think it's debatable. It really depends on your experience with this game. I've seen people hate on the game. I've seen people love the story. Personally, I found the story to be a bit of a disappointment, but maybe that's just because of my own wishful thinking of what I thought this game would be. Combat, some people prefer the new style. Some people would have preferred probably turn-based. Some people would prefer a more in-depth combat system. I'm one of the people that would have preferred more mechanics and a more intriguing combat system compared to the hold your hand approach. I think for the average player, it really could go either way with the combat. It depends on what they feel. Overall, it was a unique combat experience, and it did have an in-depth story. Just with so many large developers making games, they don't always quite feel like they're made for me anymore. So it's easy to get discouraged when these titles come out and just not enjoy them. I still think some good came out of Final Fantasy 16, even if I think it missed the mark for myself overall. I hope that you all enjoyed the critique and analysis of this game. I know at points I may be all over the place as there was a lot to go over, and I try to keep it as organized and concise so it was easy to follow. If you did enjoy the video, it really helps me out if you can hit that like button and consider subscribing if you do enjoy this style of content. Make sure to leave some comments down below with any questions, concerns, or if you just have any comments about the game or any video ideas. I always love interacting and having more in-depth conversations of any games you may want me to do a critique on or just anything you want me to talk about. As always, I will see you guys in the next one.